Okay, great. I will go ahead and get started. I'm sure as I am giving some housekeeping comments here that that people will be calling in. Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the 7th installment of the U.S. Asia Institute's Southeast Asia in Focus initiative. For those of you who have joined this series or our other events in the past, welcome back. And for those of you who are new to the U.S. Asia Institute, thank you for joining us for this important conversation today. My name is Zev Moses, Director of International and Government Affairs at the U.S. Asia Institute. And just for a bit of brief background, USAI is a nonpartisan, United Nations affiliated nonprofit with over a 42-year track record of building, understanding, and strengthening ties between the people and governments of the United States and Asia. This Southeast Asia in Focus initiative is a series of standalone briefings that began in fall 2020 and aims to examine key issues and topics in the region and the U.S. relationship with Southeast Asia and its individual countries. Our previous events in this series have focused on issues including maritime security, the future of U.S. leadership in the region, trade, energy, the Mekong Delta, and more. And we plan to host events in this series about once a month. We'll close with the 8th installment in this series in mid-December, so about a month from today. Just a couple quick housekeeping notes. I'd like to give a special thanks for the support of USAI's corporate stakeholders for helping make this program possible. Las Vegas Sands, AIG, ConocoPhillips, Fairfield Maxwell, FedEx, and Walmart. And I'd also like to note that the last 15 minutes or so of today's briefing, there will be time for questions from the audience. So if you have a question you would like for our speakers to address, please type it into the Q&A function at any time, or you can directly message me and we can make sure that your question is addressed. Now moving on to today's program, I'd like to introduce our moderator for this discussion. Javed Chaudhry serves as of counsel at Jones Day, where he specializes in domestic international mergers and acquisitions in the infrastructure, manufacturing, technology, oil and gas, healthcare, and education spaces. Prior to joining Jones Day, Javed worked in previous roles as general counsel for Sempra Energy and Gateway. Javed is also the vice chairman of the U.S. Asia Institute's Board of Trustees. We're very fortunate to have him with us today. I believe he just got back from a trip to London. So thank you, Javed, and without further ado, I'll pass it over to you.
Thank you very much. I've had the privilege of being associated with the Institute for some 40 years now, soon after it was formed. I think the Institute has always tried to be a bridge for communications and understanding. We're obviously nonpartisan. We just want to work on establishing the facts. I suppose, you know, the pandemic has been front and center in the lives of each of us, wherever we might be in the world. The US Asia Institute has felt a particular need in the last 2 years to begin to focus on the all-important ASEAN region, its relationships with the US and with the world at large. So we're very privileged to have 3 wonderful spokespersons who can help us understand how things have been going in the region and speak to both some of the challenges as well as I think the right word is victories of how they have dealt with the pandemic. So let me briefly introduce them, and really the floor is going to be theirs. We will, as Zev noted, going to be talking with them in terms of some questions, but mostly each will make a presentation in turn. So briefly to introduce them, and you will see their bios in the links in the chat function. First, Mark Mealy, who is the Senior Vice President of Policy for the US ASEAN Business Council. He has over 20 years of experience in international trade and economics. He's been with the Council for almost 10 years as a Senior Director for Malaysia, the Philippines, and Brunei. And he's the coordinator of the Council's ASEAN Financial Services Working Group, obviously a very important function. Next, we're delighted to have, located in Indonesia, at least this week, Dr. Fajar Hirawan. Dr. Hirawan is taking part, obviously, as I mentioned, in a very different time zone, so we're grateful that he's up late at night. He's with the Department of Economics in the Center for Strategic and International Studies. and he focuses on improving the economy in the global world, including relatingly importantly to food security, international trade, and the digital economy. And last but not least is our good friend, Deputy Chief of Mission for the Embassy of Singapore here in Washington, Cindy Wee. Cindy is well known in Washington diplomatic circles. She arrived about now a little over 2 years ago and has become very visible in the diplomatic community. She has served in many capacities with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, covering Northeast Asia, the Asean region, Southeast Asia, and the Americas. Prior to coming to Washington, she was the Deputy Director General, of the Americas, Southeast Asia 2 and Northeast Asia directorates at different points in her career. You can, as I said, you can read more about them in the links. So without further ado, in the order that I introduced them, we will take off, starting with you, Mark.
Great, thank you so much for that introduction, and really want to thank the Asia Institute for offering this opportunity, this program. As someone who's many years ago in my career, spent 5 years on Capitol Hill as a congressional staffer, a couple of years on the Foreign Affairs Committee staff, and also on the personal staff of one of the members on the Asia Subcommittee. I think these kinds of platforms and opportunities are really valuable for those who are doing this kind of work on the Hill. I thought I would just share with the audience just some of the broader kinds of developments and trends that we at the U.S. ASEAN Business Council have observed in our continued work with countries, both governments and business communities over the last couple of years in navigating COVID in Southeast Asia. As the U.S. ASEAN Business Council, as a trade association of American companies doing business in the region, been around for over 3 decades. And really, we're seen as a sort of a stakeholder by both governments and businesses in the region. There's no question this has been a really challenging period for us and our partners and many of the groups that we work with. We've certainly always are a champion of why Southeast Asia really matters to the global economy and to America's economic interests. And therefore, ASEAN's ability to kind of navigate the COVID really matters to America. Just to give you 2 quick examples, I was just telling my colleagues earlier, we're in the process now of conducting our 2021 business mission to Malaysia literally this week. And I can tell you over the last couple of years, the way Malaysia has been able to navigate the challenge of the pandemic has directly impacted some of the challenges that we in America have faced. So for example, during our heightened period of COVID, when our cases were really high, and of course there was a great demand for increasing the supply of ventilators in America, particularly increasing the capacity of manufacturing ventilators here in America. Some of the key components to actually for US companies to make ventilators in America came from businesses and operations in Malaysia. And we actually had to, during the crisis period, we actually had worked directly with a number of companies to make sure that those components were being shipped out from Malaysia, getting here to America, so that they could then be fed into the manufacturing of those ventilators. Of course, another great example I would note is that, as we all know, in the current sort of tight global supply for semiconductor chips for the automobile sector. And we're always hearing these stories of why it's right now challenging to sort of buy new cars these days. Part of that tight supply chain also, again, pivots around Malaysia, because many folks may not realize, but Malaysia roughly supplies anywhere between 7 to 8% of such chips that are fed into the global supply chains of automobile companies. And as you can imagine, in a tight environment, plus or minus 7 or 8% of supply, that can really make a significant impact on the ability of the car industries, again, to produce their vehicles. So, over the last couple of years, we should think back, in 2020, for example, the sort of the broader socioeconomic impacts on COVID in Southeast Asia were oftentimes really portrayed as very limited. And in fact, countries like Vietnam, for example, were really celebrated as like global success stories in really maintaining an ability to really keep the pandemic down to very small numbers. And of course, while we were celebrating that, and many countries in the region were really happy about their successes, those fortunes really changed in 2021. And we certainly saw this year where COVID began to obviously have significant negative impacts on the societies and the economies of countries in the region. Obviously, the Delta variant, became really the really most significant thing. And of course, during that period of where the crisis was really heightened across the region, we saw a wide range of sort of responses. And I'll just share a couple of them with you. For many countries, they went through implementing and imposing varying degrees of strict economic and social lockdowns. In some countries, in fact, for periods of time, citizens were really not even allowed to leave their homes unless they were going to work or going to get food, so to speak. And that varied again throughout the region. In terms of the government responses, I would say if there's one probably common theme across many of the countries, many of the governments that had the wherewithal and the resources really focused on providing quote unquote income support to their citizens of their societies, particularly because so many people were obviously temporarily, put out of work or couldn't go to jobs, so to speak. So really, again, providing income to keep people able to purchase goods and services, what they needed obviously was really critical. Of course, tied to that was, and not surprising, we've seen in all societies, in those environments, the further rapid increase of people really turning to sort of the e-commerce or the digital economy to procure goods and services. People should remember Southeast Asia was already one of the world's leading, fastest growing digital economies in the world. And without question, COVID has actually accelerated that pace of digital economic development going on in Southeast Asia. We also saw, I think, two other interesting but important pieces of how, broadly speaking, ASEAN really kind of responded to COVID. Every country is different in Southeast Asia, and each country obviously had their own unique, sort of journeys in terms of navigating COVID. But you really saw, I think, at the leadership level, a real consistent prioritizing of regional cooperation. In other words, no country could solve COVID totally by itself. There has to be dimensions of sort of working together to really address the challenges. And also, one of the things that was really vital from an international trade perspective, you did really see, I think, again, at the leadership level, a real commitment to keeping supply chains open. In other words, really trying to minimize that tendency that we saw in some countries to kind of have the knee-jerk, economic, nationalism kind of responses. And I think it was really vital, I think, for Southeast Asia to at least from a branding perspective and from a leadership perspective to kind of really reiterate that we're not going to simply, close in ourselves to the rest of the world in order to respond to COVID. We see value in working with countries around the world to achieve our goals of dealing with this. So one of the things I would highlight at the US ABC that we did, we actually, our organization has over 170 member companies. We actually formed a COVID-19 task force to really kind of focus and spearhead the efforts that the American business community, as members of our organization, we're really going to try to be helpful in the following three ways. Number one, to really kind of highlight, again, the role of the private sector in supporting the public health responses to COVID. And that ranged from, donations of PPE equipment to really facilitating the supply of vaccines as they were coming online and be made available to countries in Southeast Asia. And in fact, if you look at 2 or 3 of the countries in Southeast Asia, Philippines, Indonesia in particular, as those governments that even developed their sort of national vaccine strategies to really supply vaccines in the country, both of those governments actually carved out specific roles for their respective business communities, private sector players, to actually be part of the national supply of vaccines for their societies. So I think there was a really clear recognition that governments alone would need the support of the business community wherever possible. Second area that we really our task force focused on was really supporting economic recovery of consumption and really demand-led growth in the region. People need to understand that while Southeast Asia as a region is certainly a major part of the global economy, there's also a degree of Southeast Asia's economic growth and development, which is really driven by domestic consumption, domestic investment, which is one of the reasons why the American business community sees such great opportunities in Southeast, because it's home to big markets and big consumer opportunities. And so here, our task force really focused on things like, how can we get sort of the travel and tourism sectors really restarted again? How can we see that small and medium-sized enterprises that were greatly affected by COVID and lockdown could get re-energized? And then lastly, the task force really focused on how can we work with partners in Southeast Asia to make sure that the notion of economic recovery is not just simply sort of to get back to where things were before COVID, but actually to recover by bouncing forward, because in recognition of the fact that in certain ways, there's going to be new normals in a post-COVID world. And in a sense, there is no kind of going back to the way things were before COVID. And here again, we spent a lot of time talking with governments and stakeholders about policies, regulatory reforms, things that would really strengthen ASEAN's ability to kind of bounce forward in terms of recovery. Let me close with a few final thoughts in terms of what we're seeing today at the regional. I think the first thing is very critical is that ASEAN is certainly transitioning to many of these new normals so that we do all recognize around the world. One dimension I think I really like to highlight is that new normals is that the pandemic has certainly added an additional spark to ASEAN's fast-growing innovation startup ecosystems across the region. And it's been very interesting to see that in a number of countries where we've seen startup businesses coming up with innovative products and solutions to really address COVID-related challenges and issues in various countries, including startups that are working with American multinational companies in like digital health and also, again, more and more e-commerce areas. Once again, we certainly see, as I mentioned, that sort of that increased pace of digitalization taking place in societies, business models changing, small businesses having to really go online if they want to stay successful. And we also really saw a number of very innovative and creative solutions in terms of the travel and tourism area. Again, a major source of economic growth for many societies. And we saw a number of countries, Singapore, Indonesia, Thailand, implementing what they called sort of tourism sandboxes, where they literally said, we're going to create an environment around some of our tourist hubs where we're going to allow these economic centers to really get restarted again by doing whatever it takes in terms of vaccines, testing, the travel links, et cetera, so that tourism could get restarted in a safe manner. And I think those were very innovative approaches. At the macro level, I think it's important to note that for more and more countries in Southeast Asia, COVID now is being perceived as not a quote unquote pandemic question, but really now moving towards an endemic situation. So we're no longer seeing as many governments simply saying, we're going to do whatever it takes to stop every single infection, but actually we're going to move in a direction that understands that COVID may be with us for a while. It's our job to say, if it's an endemic situation, how do we make sure it doesn't, let's say, exceed the healthcare infrastructure of our societies? How can we continue to find ways to reopen the economy and done safely? I think it's very great to see that today, roughly 40% sort of average vaccination rates across the region have been achieved, which is very positive. And in fact, in many of the ASEAN capital cities, you're seeing about an average vaccination rate between 75 to 80%. So real progress has been made in terms of that vaccinations level. And then lastly, here in 2021, while economic growth has certainly been curtailed, ASEAN normally grows at anywhere between 5 to 6% per year in terms of average GDP in the region. 2021's GDP for ASEAN as a region will probably be about 3% this year. Still quite good, but again, below historical levels. But 2022, the average forecast for GDP growth of the region is going to be back up to about 5%. which I think bodes really well for, again, the region's continued economic recovery going forward. And it's why the region, I think, will remain a very important global market for American businesses. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. That's fascinating, and I think the thought to hold on which we will spend a bit of time talking is really that what you call the new normal, and how you integrate that with what I think is the right word to use, the endemic situation going forward, and yet not only just manage to get back a recovery, but in fact, as you put it, bounce forward. So I think that's really been the question that at the US Asia Institute, without the benefit of people who are so well informed as yourself, we have been talking about. So I'm sure we'll want to talk more about that, but let's go on to Dr. Hirawan, and thank you for being here. As I said, Doctor, and the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for your kind introductions, Jafar, earlier. And I hope that I can share my screen now. Hopefully I can share. Okay, so again, thank you for the opportunity to be involved in this US Asia Institute webinar. So distinguished speakers, guests, participants, and all US Asia Institute fellows. So a very good morning for those who reside in DC, and very good evening for those based in Jakarta and the surroundings. So on these occasions, I would like to share my thought on Indonesia's economic outlook in the midst and post-pandemic. So as you may know that, the pandemic has brought immediate disruptions, like in economic activities across the regions. The pandemic, has declined the tourism flows. There is a disruptions in air travels, and also a weakening consumers and business confidence. Well, as a starter, I would like to remind all of us that the global mega trends and disruptions shape and reshape our world. So in 2016, PricewaterhouseCoopers has listed 5 keys mega trends that might shape our global order. Such as demographic change, the rise of technology, rapid urbanizations, the climate change and resource scarcity, and the shift in the global economic power. Then there are several other elements, such as shift in geopolitics, the rise of middle class income, rise of emerging economies, and also the international trade and finance integrations. So, from the Indonesian perspective, as you might see, and you probably have heard, that you can see that from the Indonesian's manufacturing industry's perspective, the first wave of the pandemics in Indonesia had successfully declined the PMI index here, and it took at least 5 to 6 months to recover from the contractions. The first pandemic wave in Indonesia had also successfully created uncertainty between April 2020 until the end of 2020 for the Indonesia's consumer confidence index. The optimism in consumption finally took place in the second quarter of 2021, so between April to June 2021. As you can see that, in the second quarter of 2021, we had successfully grown at 7%. It's the highest, during the pandemic. And meanwhile, you can see the second pandemic wave in Indonesia seems not as bad as the first wave, since Indonesian manufacturing industry index here, and also the consumers' confidence index can rebound faster in the level of expansion and optimism. So I think, the government learned from the first wave, and I think, the government of Indonesia already know how to handle, at least, to give a buffer for the poor in order to maintain the household consumption growth. And you can see that if we highlight Indonesia's GDP growth trend from 2018 to the third quarter of 2021, Indonesia could maintain its economic growth at level of 5% until 2019. And due to the pandemic, as you can see that, Indonesian GDP growth dropped to the level of minus 2.07% year on year. So this year, we hope that, we will likely experience a positive economic growth again, since you can see that the second quarter and the third quarter of 2021, Indonesia has successfully grown at 7.07% and 3.51% year on year, respectively. So household consumptions and also investment are still become the major contributor for Indonesia's GDP. And I think, in the third quarter of 2021, the hike of the commodity prices recently has helped Indonesian economic growth, because Indonesia enjoyed a high growth in its export and had succeeded in becoming a top contributor to its GDP growth. So previously, I think Mark mentions about the vaccination trend. So I can say that the positive growth of Indonesia's GDP in the third quarter of 2021 has also contributed by the positive vaccination trend, and also the rise of public awareness of the health protocol against COVID-19. As you can see, based on COVID facts data up to 14 November 2021, so Indonesia already have more than 200 million doses of vaccine. And then, as you can see that, still around 30% of Indonesia's populations have completed the vaccination process, the first dose and the second dose. So you can see that the significant increase in the number of populations completed vaccination has taken place after the second wave. So it is around July 2021. So talking about the threat perspective, I can say that from this figure, as you can see, ASEAN, China, and the US are still consistently becoming Indonesia's strategic trading partners. So ASEAN's total trade market share with Indonesia is around 21 to 24%, followed by China, which is around 17 to 23%, and the US is around 8 to 9%. In the last 4 years, 2017 to 2020, Indonesia also consistently experienced a trade surplus with the US. If we explore more the trade between Indonesia and its strategic partners, the market share of Indonesian export in the US market has been relatively stable, in the last 4 years, so hovering around 10 to 11%. So meanwhile, the market share of Indonesia's import from the US is also stable at the level of 5 to 6%. If you want to be more specific, like from the table here, you can see that Indonesia-US threat composition during 2017 to 2020, you can see that based on the latest data from the UN Comtrade in 2020, Indonesia's top 2 export products to the US market consists of textile and clothing products, and also the machinery and electrical products. Meanwhile, Indonesia's top 2 imports from the US market are vegetable products and also the machinery and electrical products. However, if you see all these, 5 products there, it seems that there's a complementary trade between Indonesia and the US. How about the investment then? So from the investment perspective, you may see that the US, Japan, EU, and China are the top investor in ASEAN, or even you can see that the US investment is the highest in the ASEAN, and it has reached around 34.7 billion, or it's around 25% from the total investment in ASEAN. The intra-ASEAN investment is also significant, hovering around 12 to 17% since 2014. But unfortunately, if you can see what happened in Indonesia, the US investment is not the highest, but it's still among Indonesia's top 10 biggest investors in 2020. And hopefully, with the Indonesian government omnibus law and also other structural reform efforts could attract more and more investors to come to Indonesia, particularly from the US. And I can say that the reindustrializations, the connectivity and innovation are the development areas that the investors could fill. In the area of innovation, I think we should be aware that Indonesia will be filled with a majority productive age populations in 2045 when we celebrate our Independence Day, the 100th of our Independence Day. This demographic bonus momentum, I think, should be in line with the effort of improving the digital technology capacity. So therefore, you can see that Indonesia could learn more from the US as one of the leading countries in the digital economy, especially from the aspect of the human capital, innovation, and also the regulations. My previous statement, I can say that, of course, has the background. And as you can see, based on the Global Innovation Index database from the World Intellectual Property Organizations, the United States is among top-ranked countries after Switzerland and Sweden. And meanwhile, Indonesia is only ranked 87 from the 132 countries analyzed in this index. So as the last statement, or in the last slide, I can say that, the current disruptions, such as the rise of digital technology, the economic transformation, and also the pandemic distortion has accelerated some potential sectors in Indonesia, including the health services and also the information and communication sectors. Information and communication sectors, I think, as you may check the data, grow significantly in 2020. It's around 10%. I think it's due to the massive usage of the information communications during the lockdown or during the limited mobility of the humans during the pandemic. The second point that I want to say in this forum, that the positive trend of vaccination rate and also the rise of public awareness of health protocol have helped Indonesia's economic stability, especially after the second wave of the pandemic. The third points that I want to make here, that I can say that Indonesia and the US bilateral trade shows the complementarity, and you can see the top 5 products seems unique, and then it should be fill one in another. And the fourth point that I want to make here, that the US investment projects in Indonesia should focus more on promoting sustainable and inclusive economic growth. And last but not least, like I mentioned to you before, that there are some development areas that have to be prioritized, and I think it's could become a hint or a clue for those who want to invest in Indonesia. So I can say that the reindustrializations, the connectivity, and innovation are the development areas that the government now want to be already will become a priority for the Indonesia's economic development. And as you may know that next year we're going to host a G20. It will be quite busy, and then we know that we hope that the G20 also could focus on how to recover from this pandemic, and also to increase the the resilience of the economy, especially in the regions. So thank you, Jafat, for your kindness, and then hopefully we can have a Q&A after this. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Fajar, and I think there are going to be several questions for you coming out of your talk, and I think especially with the complementary trade issues and how that might grow going forward. But so now we will turn to DCM Cindy Wee for the view from Singapore point of view. Cindy?
Thank you. So thank you, everyone, and good morning again. My name is Cindy Wee. I'm the Deputy Chief of Mission from the Singapore Embassy in Washington, D.C. So I'm very happy to share with you Singapore's journey in confronting the COVID-19 pandemic. I'll shift the gear a little bit here. Mark and Fajar has shared very interesting data and facts about what hits the U.S. businesses, including the regional companies who are investing in the region. I thought of sharing with you, how the public sector, or basically the government of Singapore, has handled this journey. So it has been almost 2 years since the virus first hit the world, including the region as well as Singapore. So with new variants emerging and the virus continuing to affect many around the globe, Singapore has recently shifted its focus away from a zero COVID policy to one living with COVID. I think like what Mark said, being endemic. So if some of you remembered at the beginning of this pandemic, there were some reports that have complimented Singapore for being the gold standard. I mean, it's an honor, but we are never complacent because we know, this is a stage where many people are not aware what this virus is about. We do what we can. We drew experience from how we handled SARS in 2003. We triggered the Asean response very quickly, very effectively. But today, some people ask, oh, Singapore, you're now seeing a few thousand new infections in a day. So has Singapore failed? Has Singapore succeeded? What is the verdict, or what is the report card for Singapore? It's too early to jump into conclusions, but we deal with it as we have more information. So as I mentioned, when the virus first hit us, we adopted a zero COVID strategy in 2020 and early 2021. So, and why did we do that? This is a time when, again, the virus was very unknown to us. Our population was not yet vaccinated. And we have seen stories and, in fact, real life stories of how people suffered from being infected. The US was not spared. The world was not spared. We succeeded in this early strategy. Singapore has one of the lowest COVID-19 death rates in the world. Even today, we are at 0.2%. So while the circumstances have not changed, vaccine has been a game changer. Like what Mark said, the region is getting vaccinated. We have seen very positive vaccination rates across the region. I think one thing is people are very, they're not resistant. They are actually happy to see the positive effects of it. So Singapore's population is vaccinated is about 85%. Our vaccination rate is amongst the top 10 in the world. So while today our daily case count is still in the thousands, more than 98% are mild. So we don't really end up in ICU or having very difficult cases. Now, why is this so? We are a bit of culprit of our own early success because of how low it was in the beginning. So today, our population is COVID naive. We have very low natural immunity because we have very few people who were infected and recovered from it. So to lower the risk of breakthrough infections, we have now introduced booster shots to our national vaccination strategy. And all individuals above 30 years old are advised to receive a booster shot. So with that, Singapore has adjusted our strategy to living with COVID-19. As you know, Singapore is a very small country. We have no natural resources. We are dependent on trade for survival. Our trade is 3 times our GDP. So the adjustment is not a rash decision. It is backed by a highly vaccinated population, scientific evidence on the benefits of booster shots, which is easily available to all the people. So what happens in Singapore is that if you have completed your 2 doses, you'll receive a SMS or a text message to your phone and say that, hey, come along, you are ready for your booster shot. And you can find it easily available. So, and coupling this strategy is a range of approaches that involve all walks of life. There are several elements to this strategy which the Singapore government makes an effort to communicate to the public in easily digestible formats. We've prepared some of these infographics on the screen that I'd like to share with you. So this is what we call, this appears as two different flyers, but it actually on papers, on social media, on major dailies, they all appear as one page. So the strategy can be categorized into 4 pillars. I like to label them as the 4 R's. So first, respect. Living with COVID-19 requires an update in mindsets. We've urged the society to respect that COVID-19 exists, but we are not paralyzed by the fear of it. So instead, people are encouraged that you go about daily activities by respecting the social distancing measures in place and measures such as mask wearing. Second, responsibility. So living with COVID means that everyone is responsible in playing their part. If you test positive or come into contact with someone who tested positive, there are clear protocols to follow to self-isolate. It is a collective effort to keep the community safe. So third, readiness. To move into the normal activities, we continue to expand healthcare capacity and strengthen case management with vaccines, testing, and tracing. So as more people are vaccinated, exposed to and recover from the virus, our immunity levels will increase too. Fourth, and probably what is of interest to many of us here, to reopen. So Singapore needs to reconnect back to the world and reopen our borders safely. We have announced the vaccinated travel lane with 18 countries, including the United States. Even with the use of virtual tools, we recognize the need for companies, investors to travel to conduct their regional and global businesses. This includes the over 5,500 US businesses based in Singapore. An interesting fact, before COVID, Singapore has about 4,500 US companies operating from Singapore. During this COVID and to date, we actually increased by 1,000. So the pandemic has not stopped interactions, has not stopped interest from the US into the region. And Singapore is very happy to be part of this, part of their interest to source for more markets. In addition, the people-to-people exchanges, which are a core part of Singapore's relationship with the US, need to resume. So for friends and colleagues who join us today, we welcome the cordial and staff-level visits to Singapore. We are also heartened to see that the university exchange programs and tourism between our two countries can now take place again. In fact, as we speak today, the Bloomberg New Economy Forum is being held in Singapore over the next few days. I'll now move on, so besides domestically, on the global stage, what have we been doing? As we know, the virus knows no borders and no one is safe until everyone is safe. So Singapore is contributing to the global fight against the pandemic. I like to describe this as like a ripple effect. So what do we do? What can Singapore do bilaterally? So first, we ensured that vaccines go where they are needed most through a combination of donations and swaps on a bilateral basis. There has been quite strict legal protocols in terms of donating vaccines. It's not as easy as, I bought something and then I can actually channel it. So it requires some legal instruments to do that. But where it's possible, we do donations and swaps on a bilateral basis to countries who need it more urgently. And then we have also donated PPEs and critical supplies and established an oxygen shuttle with Indonesia. So Beyond the first ripple, we talk about the regional ripple. We've donated our share of vaccines under the COVID-19 Asean Response Fund to other ASEAN member states and the ASEAN Secretariat. The US is a key contributor to this regional effort. It has delivered over 30 million doses of vaccines, contributed 500,000 to the response fund, and now up to 50 million in new efforts in the health sector. On the global scale, we have strongly supported the vaccine multilateralism. Singapore is the co-chair of the Friends of the COVAX facility, together with Switzerland. We've contributed 5 million to the COVAX Advanced Market Commitment. We've also made investments that will add to future global health security through working with partners on pathogen surveillance and clinical trials. During the Vice President Kamala Harris' visit to Singapore in August, we've announced collaboration towards increasing regional preparedness and strengthening Southeast Asia's ability to prevent, detect, and respond to COVID-19 and future health security threats. So in conclusion, we know that the COVID-19 pandemic is far from over, but Singapore is committed to work with the international community to emerge stronger from the pandemic and work towards greater resilience in the face of future challenge. Thank you. I'll pass the mic to Javed. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cindy. Very interesting. I think all three of you have brought up some common themes, but let me start actually with you, Cindy, and then I hope that Fajar and Mark will also contribute. Unfortunately, in this country, as we know, and I speak as a former scientist, or still a scientist, I guess, there are a large number of people who have resisted getting the vaccine, and indeed people who resist wearing masks where, like in my office, we are supposed to in common areas. But in some institutions, that's been a problem, as we know. What is the situation with those sorts of resistance in Singapore?
Javed, thanks for the question. I would say that there are indeed some cases like this. We have plateaued at about 85% vaccination rate for a while. There are other reasons for the remaining 15%. So first of all is there's a certain population of children below 12 years old. So that takes a certain percentage. And the other, another part are people with underlying medical conditions. So if we deducted these two groups of people, the remaining population who are resistant to be vaccinated is actually very low. One thing that was announced recently, which have also caught the US media attention, was that the Singapore government has now said that if you refuse to be vaccinated and you are infected and end up seeking medical treatment, the government will no longer pay the medical bills of these people. What we were actually quite happy to hear is that people actually supported this measure, because it's no longer just about, so it comes back to the point of you being responsible for yourself, for your family, and for the people who are working around you. So I think increasingly the idea that you have to play a part has sink into the society in understanding that. There are I would say there are a few tools to it. One, of course, there's the legal perspective. We were pretty strict with people who don't wear masks. So people love to say Singapore is a fine city. So I guess if you are, if you are mandated to wear a mask and you don't do that, which is actually increasing the risk to the people around you, you could be fined for that. So, but two, most important thing is the public education and public communication. We know that everyone have your loved ones. whether it's your family members, your co-workers, your friends. How would you feel if if you are the one spreading the risk or you're spreading the virus to the others? I think that is a more powerful tool than just about the legal means.
No, I think you're right. It's really one's obligation to the larger society, not least your own family. It's funny, the policy you mentioned, which did make press here. I was talking to my sister, who is a doctor in England, and her view, because she is seeing with the rates going up again in Europe, a shortage of ICU, spaces. And so her view is, if you did not take the vaccine and there wasn't an other reason, such as a medical reason, etc., then you shouldn't be occupying an ICU bed. She goes, now we still have to treat such people, but why should we give them the extreme level of care when they have chosen themselves not to, get the necessary protection? But Dr. Hirawan, what's the situation in Indonesia in terms of the level of vaccination, and also the question of people who refuse to take the vaccine for whatever reason?
Thank you, Javad. I think, like I mentioned to all of you before, that we already experiencing the second wave of the pandemic. During July 2021, and I can say that the death toll at the time, it's quite high. So I think since then, I think the public awareness, to get vaccinated, is quite significant, and people now are not too picky. Before, there's like a skepticism, to get a vaccines, and then people tend to be picky, what kind of vaccine that they want to consume, for example, because sometimes they don't believe with the Chinese vaccines, they prefer the Pfizer and so on and so forth, and something like that. But now I think, because we already have the apps, the government create an apps. So if we want to access the public places like a hospital, like a shopping mall, and so on and so forth, we have to scan the QR code, and then at least you have to get a vaccine, at least the first dose of vaccine. So I think that's the situation now in Indonesia. But I think the other factors why vaccinations become an issue in Indonesia, I think because of the logistic as well, Jafar. Because Indonesia, consists of so many islands, 17,000 islands and 5 big islands. So I think it's very difficult as well, in order to again get an access to have the vaccine access to the people or the community in the remote areas. So I think that's also one of the challenges that we are facing.
No, that's a very good point, Fajar, because I know just by comparison in parts of Africa that I'm very familiar with, you don't even have people with IDs and all, and a lot of them are living in rural areas. So even the idea of 2 doses, to your point about which vaccine to pick, is difficult because you don't know if you're going to see that person again, or that in fact that person has had 1 dose yet. So Mark, you had, let me switch subjects slightly. You made 2 points which I think are very interesting, and I'm sure they tie into the whole region, not least Singapore, which is trying to increase travel and tourism all over again. And you described, Mark, the idea of tourism hubs. And I think we've read some stuff in the papers about variations on a theme where you're going to have sort of regional corridors, I guess you could call them. How would that work, given what we've just heard about the uncertainty of everybody getting a vaccine, especially in some of the numerous islands in Indonesia?
Yeah, I think the concept is a very innovative one, in the sense that, and Fajar knows this, like in the case of Bali, which is a world-class tourist destination, which obviously is an important source of economic activity for the country. When COVID hit, Bali closed down like every place else closed down. And then as the government said, okay, well, we're going to develop our strategy to deal with COVID. And we think we should really try to create something specialized for the reality of Bali. One, for that part of the society and its role that it plays in terms of the tourism and economy. And so the specialized solution was, as we roll out sort of our national vaccine strategy, the government said, we're going to make sure that people who quote unquote work in Bali, particularly in the tourism sector, you're going to be a priority to be vaccinated. And when it comes to efforts around testing, the government said, we're going to make sure that testing is going to be done like at every major tourism facility operation in the entire island. And then when it came to the travel piece, they basically said, okay, we're going to allow people to come to Bali, but there has to be that sort of proof of vaccination and proof of testing. So in a sense, we're going to create this special tourism sandbox with the necessary resources and standard operating procedures to allow us to reopen, to Bali for tourism and get that part of the economy going. And then we saw the same thing in Phuket in Thailand. We saw the same thing in Langkawi in Malaysia, similar sort of specialized programs. Not a perfect solution, but it just showed the degree of focus and innovation to put in place whatever measures they thought were possible to do that. Now, the corridor question, I think, is relevant, as you said, when it comes to sort of the internal or domestic tourism. Can Malaysians who might normally go to Bali, are we going to be able to make sure that's also part of the equation, for internal tourism in Malaysia? And that obviously would then feed into, though, are all Malaysians getting vaccinated? Is there still certain parts of the community that are hesitant? I think, again, those points are certainly valid. But I would argue, or I would assume that those same types of procedures, requirements, et cetera, would apply for domestic Malaysian travelers who want to go to Langkawi, just as sort of foreign visitors who want to enjoy the hospitality and the environment of Langkawi.
No, that seems very reasonable. So actually, that brings up another question that I think a number of people have, which is, even I use the example of East Africa. It seems like everybody has even at least a flip phone, because there's what's called M-Pesa, it's digital currency, much like we have Venmo and stuff here, except that it started many years ago there. It was almost the first place that I saw it happen, which was wonderful. But a lot of what we've been talking about, including the whole idea of the expansion of the digital economy, assumes that every citizen, or most citizens, have the wherewithal to have internet connectivity and devices. And so let me ask each of you, I know Singapore really well, and I suspect that Cindy's daughter has actually 2 phones, so there's no problem in Singapore. But what about Indonesia, and what about the rest of the ASEAN region in terms of the prevalence of devices where you can engage in the digital economy? Let's start with you, Mark.
Well, yeah, I think, as we've noted, the digital economy development trajectory was already robust and strong. I actually posted some factoids in the chat. COVID has further accelerated that pace of digitalization across all societies. And in fact, it's now once again raising the existing questions of how can societies ensure that this pace of digitalization, as it increases at a faster rate, doesn't further exacerbate issues around digital divide, and doesn't further is done in ways that are not really fostering more inclusivity. And I think those again remain fundamental challenges because, as we must keep in mind, each country in ASEAN again is on their own sort of respective national digital journey, and the pressure that the increased pace of digitalization is causing is now for governments and regulators, policymakers and regulators, to actually have to figure out what are going to be our laws around privacy. How are we strengthening cybersecurity? What's going to be our regulations around the ability of data to flow across borders? So now these things were already being, how should we say, movement was already starting to figure these things out at the national level. We in the United States business community were also urging countries to also take into account regional dimensions, because we think it would not be as effective if each ASEAN country kind of all did their own thing on cybersecurity, privacy, et cetera, et cetera. And that's where this notion of the potential value of digital agreements, that if countries subscribe to a single agreement, it would help, I think, influence the nature of their national sort of policy environments in ways that create sort of a consistency across the region. But these are things that are going on literally as we speak right now. Governments are really figuring these things out.
That's good to hear. Now, Fajar, I know that Indonesia is about as diverse a country as one can imagine, with people from who are, practically living in a different sort of almost level of history than the big cities. How does this, how prevalent is the ability of people to have apps on their phones and that sort of thing in some of the remote islands?
Thank you, Jafar. So I can say that it's true that Indonesia, I think, are still developing, our digital infrastructures. At least we should have like a same access, from the west to the east and from the north to the south. Because I think our geographical condition, I think, is quite unique. And then besides the digital infrastructures, I can say that the digital literacy of the people also have to be improved. Because sometimes we should make sure that they know what to do. With their smartphone. If you ask me about the smartphone penetrations and then how many people already have an access with the smartphone, I think I think it's already have a significant increase. In the last 5 years, I think more than 90% now. I guess, based on the data from the associations. And I believe that, I think that's also one of the things that have to be, highlighted. But I think one thing's also that, become our challenges, I think we are still also have to focus more on the issues of the cross-border digital economy. I think we, as the countries, we don't want people, country outside Indonesia thinks that we are trying to be more protective, because the issues of the cross-border digital economy also become one of our concerns, besides the issue of the cyber security, like Mark mentions before. So I think that's also that's my comments on that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Cindy, I know that there is no shortage of phones in Singapore, so that issue doesn't arise, but I'd like to switch to a slightly different question with respect to Singapore. As you noted, Singapore's lifeblood is trade. And we, of course, here in the US every day read about the supply chain issues, including ships, that can't come and go on a normal schedule and all that sort of a thing. Have any of those issues, either from an export or import point of view, affected Singapore?
Thanks, Javed, for the question. I think from the very beginning of this pandemic, if we all remember just a year and a half ago, there was a mad global scramble for the PPEs, whether it was the mask, even for gloves, or other medical supplies. And at a time when people are not very aware of where this virus is leading, there is a tendency to self-protect, to grab what you have. But even then, at a point, Singapore's key principle, consistent principle, was that we have to keep supply chain open, connected, and resilient. So there are a few principles that I thought of sharing with you, because the emphasis on resilience and self-sufficiency it needs to be carefully judged. If it goes too far, I think it prompts reactions and unintended consequences. The deep bifurcation of global trade and technology actually leave all of us poorer and less secure. So I thought of sharing just 3 elements to consider. One, domestic production. ASEAN is a key production base for many companies around the world, including for the US companies. You can probably assemble the whole production chain in ASEAN, from Indonesia, Vietnam, Cambodia, or even Singapore. So we have moved, in the past, the inventory was just enough inventory. But I think today we are slowly moving into a just-in-case inventory. So how do we adjust to that? We would be too costly. We think it's too costly and challenging to replicate a full ecosystem. To just try to design and manufacture, for example, the semiconductor chips within any one country. This is the same for biomedical research and vaccine production. So we believe in diversity in order to keep this chain going. The second I thought of sharing was about source diversity. Again, when we talk about about the world as a production market, it's no longer just single market or single production. So diversification will actually involve governments as well as public sector. We will intervene in commercial investment decisions, carry out in transparent and even-handed manner. So this is why Singapore strongly supports the WTO in working on multilateral framework. In the region, as Mark and Fajar talk about digital economy, Singapore is also actively looking at developing digital economy framework with like-minded countries. We have done so with Chile and New Zealand. We've done bilateral with Australia. These are just what we think as pathfinders. The intention was actually to expand to the whole region. And of course, the third thing was about network reliability. So as I mentioned earlier, we've never restricted export of any goods produced in or transshipped through Singapore, not even goods which we needed urgently, like the N95 respirators and vaccines, or even the mask at the beginning of the pandemic. So we hope, this is Singapore playing our part in the global supply chain. We hope that the others would also see the benefit of doing so. I think one key question being raised today was about the port congestion in the US. People are saying whether they'll be getting their Christmas presents in time, or whether my Christmas gifts will cost more. So one of the things that we actually did during this pandemic is that we vaccinated all the port workers and the ship crew. Doesn't matter whether they are Singapore citizens or not, so long as you work in Singapore, we want to make sure that they are safe, they are comfortable, and that we can keep on going. So, and Singapore ports, as you know, is a 24/7 operating ports. So
that's it's actually a perfectly selfish thing to do in the interests of everybody, to the frontline workers. Let me perhaps we have time for a couple more questions, or one for all three of you, and I'll start with you, Mark. Here in Washington, even, right, I'm talking to various colleagues in other, for example, law firms or organizations. And one of the things that one hears is the new normal, if you will, which is that the pandemic has taught all of us that we can probably work in a hybrid fashion. We don't, I'm a classic example when I'm not traveling to put on my suit early in the morning and drag myself into Washington, the usual situation. And now it doesn't seem nearly as necessary every day. And I was talking to a couple of colleagues from some other law firms who said that in each case they had given up on some options for additional space, and that their managements were thinking about the hoteling concept, much like accounting firms have, where you don't have a nice office all to yourself. You just come in and plug your computer at a desk. So I'm wondering if, and what's your perspective from an overall ASEAN perspective of whether there is now going to be oversupply of office space, for example, in Singapore, which is, the glorious skyline of all those beautiful buildings, in Jakarta equally and every other place. But have you sort of studied that and what's going to happen in the new normal with that issue of, footage of real estate?
Yeah, I mean, well, our organization does have offices in 6 of the 10 ASEAN countries. And our staff, our employees who work in those various countries, including Singapore, and actually we're getting ready to move from one office structure to another office structure in Singapore, literally as we speak. We have an organization policy, how we're trying to sort of govern ourselves across the board. But at the end of the day, it's really going to be driven by the sort of the individual country rules, requirement, SOPs for returning to work and or being able to have some kind of a hybrid work culture and structure. I think that's going to vary by country, to say the least. I don't think there'll be a generic sort of approach within Southeast Asia. And just as in our own country, I would imagine that governments, labor groups, and business groups in each individual country are now going to have to sort of address this new reality of a new normal. Particularly, I think, as it relates to younger professionals who are entering the workplace. And just as we're seeing in my own organization and our own society, the things that they value in terms of being able to work are maybe not the same as when I was a young professional and what I valued as an employee of an organization. And I think the hybrid realities, from talking to other CEOs, for example, I think that is going to be one aspect of a new normal. I can only speak for my own organization where, we haven't been in our office physically in over almost 2 years now. And when we do go back to our office in 2022, it'll probably be in a hybrid fashion, which I hope will be appealing to some of the bright, talented young professionals that we try to attract to work at the U.S. ASEAN Business Council, as opposed to we require all people to be in the office 5 days a week, 8 hours a day. I think if we impose that type of requirement, we may find ourselves not able to attract the talent that we feel very fortunate to attract.
I think, Mark, that's exactly right. And so, Cindy, how about what's the new normal in Singapore going to look like?
Well, Javier, I must say I don't have the answer right now. It has fluctuated over the past year. When situation was not, when there were more cases, the norm was to work from home. So like you said, we have many office buildings, office spaces. The central business district has never been so empty in our history. So it has now been work hybrid or even working from home has now become a norm with technology. But I think as most of us have felt over the past few months, when US Asia Institute held your receptions, your autumn receptions and spring receptions, people were so keen and eager to come out. And
yes,
you have a wonderful reception recently. It shows that actually people crave that interaction, crave that in-person interaction. It's never the same from, doing on Zooms or, taking a phone calls.
No, I couldn't agree with you more. Well, we're running out of time here, but I think this has been actually, I'm sure we'll agree, this in some ways this is a very encouraging discussion because we've all been sort of caught in our doom and depression cycle because the world had changed from what we were used to. But what's very encouraging to hear is you have a really good trajectory in terms of vaccination in the ASEAN region. You have a plan to live with it if it's an endemic. Growth is in a good place. It looks like it's going to get better. And you've highlighted something which I think is of course, a global issue, but specifically to the ASEAN region, is some of the things that you have to deal with. I think, as you described, Cindy, Singapore being a pathfinder, whether it's rules of the digital economy, it's cybersecurity, it's privacy, all those things which, I know from personal experience are continuing to be a challenge, for example, in the EU. If you can work on them, that will both enhance economic growth and make people's lives easier. And then the final point, at least I'll stop on before handing it back to Zev, is you're so right that this is, where just like you have to wear a mask because of the person who has a health issue who's walking down the street next to you, or is your neighbor, or is your grandfather, we have an obligation to the whole world. And I have been talking to friends in Africa, where the rate of vaccination was as low as 2%, and now it's getting up to the higher, still single-digit numbers. And to the extent that I want to travel there, it's difficult to do in terms of having an integrated worldwide economy. But at least we can, I hope, start with the ASEAN region. Zev, let me turn back over to you. Thank you, all of you, for your wonderful insights. And I think your punishment for this is we'll make you come back and do this again in a short while. Zev, over to you.
Great, thank you, Javed. Really appreciate you stepping in today. I know you're probably still a little jet lagged, but you wouldn't have known that. I thought that was a really great conversation. It's not easy to moderate a panel like this. And I'd like to thank DCMWE, again, Fajar and Mark, for joining us and providing your great insight. A special thank you to Fajar for joining us this late in the evening for you out in Jakarta. You all covered a lot of the issues today, a lot of the key topics, and I wish we had more time. We certainly did not have enough time to dive into everything. But I think this was extremely valuable to have these diverse perspectives to give us a full picture of the issues. So hopefully this is just the beginning of these sorts of conversations as the US and our partners in the region work more closely together to combat this issue together. If anyone in our audience would like to follow up with any of our speakers, please reach out to us at usai@usasiainstitute.org, and we'd be happy to assist in fostering further dialogue on the things we discussed today. Just a very quick plug. I mentioned we'll be hosting the final Southeast Asia in Focus briefing in 2021 in about mid-December, probably the second week. So please stay on the lookout for an invitation to that event. And thank you again, Javed, Fajar, DCMWE, and Mark for taking the time to join us this morning. And I hope everyone has a great rest of your day. If anyone has any closing thoughts, please feel free, but thank you all again.